The most feared man in the Seoul underworld was on his knees, his immaculate black suit stained with the damp earth of a fresh grave, weeping like a child who had lost his only protection against the dark. It was a paradox that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew Jun-ho Park by reputation alone. He was the iron fist of the syndicate, a man who negotiated treaties with blood and silenced dissent with a single, cold glance. Yet here, in the suffocating silence of the private cemetery, stripped of his lieutenants and his soldiers, he was merely a husband whose heart had been ripped from his chest. The funeral procession had dispersed hours ago, the black umbrellas and whispered condolences fading into the gray mist, leaving him alone with the terrifying reality of the headstone. The granite was cold, polished to a mirror sheen, bearing the name that had been his only prayer, Elena Park. Below her name were the dates that marked a life far too short, a life that had been vibrant and luminous only days ago. The scent of white lilies, sickeningly sweet and heavy, hung in the stagnant air, mocking him with their funereal perfection. Jun-ho traced the letters of her name with trembling fingers, his knuckles white, his breath hitching in ragged gasps that tore at his throat. He had failed the one vow that mattered more than his oath to the Brotherhood. He had sworn to protect her from his world, to keep the blood and the violence outside the walls of their sanctuary, but the darkness had seeped in anyway. The grief was not just a weight, it was a physical agony, a crushing pressure that made his lungs burn and his vision blur. He remembered the phone call, the frantic race to the hospital, the doctor's solemn face telling him it was a sudden aneurysm, a freak medical tragedy that no amount of money or power could have prevented. But looking at the fresh dirt, a seed of denial took root in his gut. Not the denial of a grieving widower, but the instinct of a predator who senses a trap. Elena had been healthy, vibrant, full of a light that balanced his shadows. To lose her so suddenly felt like a cosmic joke, a punishment for the sins he had committed to build his empire. He rested his forehead against a cold stone, the dampness seeping into his skin, and let out a guttural roar of anguish that echoed off the surrounding mausoleums. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. He did not care if the ghosts of his ancestors were watching. He did not care about dignity. Without Elena, the empire he controlled was nothing but dust and ash. He whispered to the earth, his voice cracking, "I should have been the one. It should have been me." The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around him, sounding like 1,000 whispering voices, but none of them answered him. He was alone in a world that had suddenly lost its color, leaving only shades of gray and the black abyss of his sorrow. 50 yards away, concealed within the dense shadow of an ancient weeping willow, a woman watched the scene unfold with a hand pressed violently over her mouth to stifle a sob. She was dressed in heavy mourning veils that obscured her features, indistinguishable from the other distant mourners who had lingered earlier, but she had not left. Elena Park was not in the coffin beneath the earth. She was standing on trembling legs, her heart shattering as she watched the strongest man she ever knew crumble. Seeing Jun-ho this way, broken, defenseless, and raw, tore at her soul more than her own physical pain. For the last 48 hours, she had believed that he was the one who ordered her death. The betrayal had tasted like bitter almonds in her morning tea, a paralysis that crept through her veins and locked her muscles, while her mind screamed in terror. She had heard the voices while she lay frozen, unable to blink, unable to breathe, as they prepared her body for the morgue. She had heard the conspirators laughing, discussing how easy it was to remove the foreigner who distracted the boss. But she had been saved by a miracle, a debt repaid by a coroner who owed her his life, who had swapped the death certificate and injected the antidote just moments before the embalming began. She had stayed hidden, terrified, convinced that Jun-ho had tired of her, that he had chosen power over love. But now, witnessing his agony, the truth washed over her with the force of a tidal wave. He didn't know. He wasn't the architect of her destruction. He was the primary victim. The realization brought a surge of relief that was immediately followed by a cold, sharp terror. If Jun-ho didn't kill her, then the people closest to him did, people he trusted with his life, people who were likely standing beside him at the funeral service just hours ago, patting his back with hands stained in her metaphorical blood. She gripped the rough bark of the willow tree, her fingernails digging in until they broke. She wanted to run to him, to scream his name, to pull him up from the mud, and wipe the tears from his face. But she knew that to reveal herself now, in the open, would be a death sentence for them both. The killers were watching. They were waiting for him to break, waiting for his grief to make him careless, so they could slide a knife between his ribs and take the throne. She had to be dead for a little while longer. She had to be the ghost they feared. Elena's eyes, usually warm and full of laughter, hardened into flint. She adjusted her veil, turning her gaze from her weeping husband to the skyline where their enemies celebrated. They thought they had buried a delicate flower, but they had planted a seed of vengeance. She would not just survive, she would become the weapon Junho needed, even if he didn't know it yet. Across the city, in the penthouse suite of a gleaming skyscraper that overlooked the Han River, the atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of triumphant celebration. Kenji, Junho's second-in-command and cousin, swirled a glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking softly, a sound that seemed to punctuate his satisfaction. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling metropolis as if he already owned it. Behind him, lounging on a velvet sofa with a predatory grace, was Hannah, the syndicate's chief financial strategist. They were the architects of the tragedy, the ones who had decided that Elena was a liability. "Did you see him?" Hannah asked, a cruel smirk playing on her lips as she examined her manicured nails. He looked pathetic. I almost felt embarrassed for him. The great Junho Park, reduced to a puddling mess over a woman, Kenji chuckled, a low, dry sound devoid of humor. "It was necessary," he replied, turning to face her. He was losing his edge. He was talking about legitimacy, about going clean. Elena put those soft ideas in his head. She was turning a tiger into a house cat. They raised their glasses in a silent toast to their own cleverness. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. The poison they used mimicked a cerebral hemorrhage perfectly. No autopsy would have found foul play unless they were looking for it, and the coroner was on their payroll, or so they thought. "How long do we give him?" Hannah asked, her eyes gleaming with ambition. "A week of mourning?" "2." Kenji shook his head, his expression darkening with malice. "We don't wait. We strike while he is blind with grief. We start moving the assets tomorrow. We take over the shipping routes while he is busy crying at a gravestone. By the time he wakes up from his sorrow, he will be a king without a kingdom." They laughed then, a sound that was ugly and sharp, unaware that the very corpse they mocked was currently plotting their demise. They underestimated the bond between Junho and Elena. They saw their marriage as a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. They could not comprehend that love, when threatened, does not just break. It hardens. It becomes armor. Kenji finished his drink and threw the glass into the fireplace, watching it shatter. "To the new era," he declared. "An era of strength. No more distractions. No more outsiders." The shards of glass glittered in the firelight, a foreshadowing of the fractured reality that was about to crash down upon them. Junho returned to their penthouse apartment hours later, the silence of the immense space hitting him harder than a physical blow. It was a mausoleum of memories. Her scent, vanilla and jasmine, still lingered in the air, a phantom perfume that made his knees weak. He walked through the living room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, feeling like an intruder in his own life. Every object held a story. The throw blanket she loved to curl up in, the half-read book on the side table with a bookmark still marking page 142, the coffee mug she had left in the sink. He hadn't allowed the staff to touch anything. He wanted it frozen in time, a shrine to the moment before his world ended. He poured himself a drink, his hands shaking so badly the bottle clinked rhythmically against the glass, but he didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid, seeing nothing but the void. The rage was beginning to simmer beneath the grief now, a hot, bubbling magma. Why had she died? The doctors said it was natural, but his instincts, honed by years of survival in a pit of vipers, were screaming that something was wrong. But who? Who would dare touch his wife? He walked into their bedroom, the sanctuary where they had whispered dreams of a future that would never happen. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and that was when he saw it. On the nightstand, placed precisely in the center of the surface, was a silver bracelet. His breath caught in his throat. It was a simple chain with a small charm shaped like a camellia flower. He had given it to her on their first anniversary. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Elena had been wearing this bracelet when she went to the hospital. He had seen it on her wrist when he kissed her cold hand goodbye. He had told the mortician to leave it on her, to bury her with it. He scrambled backward, knocking the lamp over, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Was he losing his mind? Was grief hallucinating objects into existence? He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the cold metal. It was real. It was solid. He picked it up, examining the clasp. It was definitely hers. Panic and confusion clouded his mind. Junho stared at the silver bracelet until the edges of his vision began to blur, the world narrowing down to that single loop of cold metal. A terrifying thought clawed its way through his mind. Someone had dug her up. Someone had desecrated her grave, stolen this jewelry, and placed it here to torment him. The rage that surged through him was blinding, white-hot and instantaneous, eclipsing the grief for a fleeting second. He snatched his gun from the holster draped over the chair and stormed out of the bedroom, moving with the lethal fluidity of a tiger hunting in the dark. He tore through the penthouse, checking every shadow, every closet, kicking open doors with a violence that splintered wood. "Show yourself," he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, raw and animalistic. "You think this is a game? Come out and die." But the apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant city noise. There was no intruder, no assassin lurking in the corners. He marched to the security room, a hidden alcove behind a bookshelf, and frantically pulled up the surveillance logs. His fingers flew across the keyboard, rewinding the footage to the time of the funeral. He watched the screen with manic intensity, waiting to see the shadow of the monster who had invaded his sanctuary. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The footage from the last 3 hours was missing. It hadn't been deleted. It had been looped. The timestamp flickered, jumping back and forth in a way that only a master hacker could orchestrate. But it wasn't the technical skill that stopped his heart. It was the access code used to bypass the system. On the log, flashing in innocuous green text, was the user ID, Elena_P. It was her private override code, a sequence of numbers based on the coordinates of the park bench where they had shared their first kiss, a secret she had never written down, a secret only she knew. Junho slumped back in the chair, the gun slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the desk. A ghost could not type. A ghost could not override a military-grade security system. The impossibility of the situation warred with the tangible evidence before him. He looked at the bracelet again, then at the screen. A new notification popped up on the monitor, a single text file named Lazarus. With a trembling hand, he opened it. The message was brief, written in the code they used when they were dating and hiding from his father's spies. The old iron mill. Midnight. Come alone, or I stay dead forever. The hope that bloomed in his chest was agonizing, sharp as a knife. It was a trap, his instinct screamed. It had to be a trap set by Kenji or a rival gang to finish him off. But as he looked at the camellia charm, he knew he didn't care. If it was a trap, he would kill them all. If it was her, the thought was too big to hold. He stood up, holstering his weapon, his face transforming from the mask of a grieving widower into the stone visage of the boss. He had a meeting to keep. The old iron mill was a skeletal ruin on the outskirts of Seoul, a relic of the industrial age that rusted silently under the moonlight. It was a place of shadows and jagged metal, the perfect stage for an execution. Junho parked his car a mile away and approached on foot, moving through the high grass like a phantom. The night was humid, the air thick with the smell of wet rust and decaying vegetation. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He had his hand on his weapon, his senses dialed up to their maximum limit, scanning the darkness for the glint of a sniper scope or the silhouette of an ambush. He entered the main hangar, a cavernous space where moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating pillars of pale light amidst the gloom. I'm here, he called out, his voice steady despite the hurricane in his heart. And this, for a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the corrugated metal. Then, a figure stepped out from behind a rusted turbine. She was wearing a dark trench coat, her hair tucked under a cap, her face obscured by shadows. But he knew the way she stood. He knew the tilt of her head. Junho stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his gun hand lowering slowly. The figure took a step forward into a pool of moonlight, and the cap was removed. Elena looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red, a bruise fading on her jawline. But she was alive. She was breathing. The reality of her presence hit him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him. He didn't run to her, he couldn't. He felt as if his legs had been turned to stone. Elena, he whispered, the name breaking on his lips. She ran to him then, closing the distance and colliding with him, her arms wrapping around his neck with desperate strength. The impact broke his paralysis. He crushed her to him, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, the warmth of her blood pulsing against his chest. It was not a dream. He fell to his knees, dragging her down with him, unable to stand under the weight of his relief. He held her face in his hands, tracing every feature, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled from her eyes. I saw you, he choked out. I saw you in the casket. I touched your hand. You were cold. It was a drug, Elena whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. Tetrodotoxin mix. It slows the heart to almost nothing. The coroner. He owes me. He swapped the body before the cremation. She pulled back slightly, her eyes locking onto his, burning with an intensity he had never seen in her before. Junho, listen to me. It wasn't an accident. It was Kenji. It was Hannah. I heard them. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body, and I heard them laughing about how they were going to take everything from you. The name of his cousin, his blood, hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Junho's expression shifted. The sorrow evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, abyssal darkness. His tears stopped. His jaw set. The transformation was terrifying to witness. The husband died, and the king of the underworld was reborn, but this time, he had a purpose that transcended greed or power. Kenji, he repeated, the name tasting like ash. He stood by me at your grave. He handed me the shovel. Elena gripped his shoulders. They think I'm dead. That is our only advantage. They think you are broken. Let them believe it. We don't just kill them, Junho. We destroy them. We make them feel every ounce of fear I felt when the darkness took me. The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Junho played his part with Oscar-worthy dedication. He stopped shaving, allowed his clothes to become rumpled, and was seen drinking heavily in public. He missed meetings, ignored calls, and let rumors circulate that the great Junho Park had lost his mind. In the privacy of the penthouse, however, the atmosphere was razor-sharp. Elena was the ghost in the machine. From a secure, hidden room in the sub-basement of one of Junho's safe houses, she orchestrated a campaign of terror. She used her knowledge of the syndicate's finances, knowledge she had gleaned over years of silent observation, to dismantle Kenji's safety net. Money began to disappear from offshore accounts, transferred into charities in Elena's name. Files containing incriminating evidence of Kenji's side deals with rival gangs appeared on the desks of the police, only to vanish before they could be acted upon, leaving a lingering scent of paranoia. But it was the personal hauntings that began to crack the antagonist's composure. Hannah was the first to fray. She returned to her apartment one evening to find her expensive collection of vintage wine shattered, the red liquid pooling on the white marble floor like blood. In the center of the mess sat a single cup of tea, the same herbal blend she had used to poison Elena. There was no note, no sign of entry, just the steaming cup. She called Kenji, screaming that someone knew, but he dismissed her as hysterical. It's Junho, Kenji insisted, though his own voice lacked conviction. He's drunk and lashing out, but Kenji was not immune. 2 days later, he found his car, a bulletproof sedan parked in a secure garage, filled with white lilies. Hundreds of them, stuffed into the cabin, pressing against the glass. The smell was overpowering, the scent of the funeral. On the driver's seat lay a copy of the eulogy he had given, with certain words circled in red ink. Loyalty. Family. Forever. Kenji ordered his guards to be beaten for the security breach, but the cameras showed nothing but static for the hour the deed was done. The fear began to rot them from the inside out. They looked at each other with suspicion. They looked at the shadows with dread. They were being hunted by a memory, and they had no weapons to fight it. The climax was set for the monthly gathering of the clan heads, a formal banquet held in the grand hall of the syndicate's headquarters. It was the night Kenji planned to officially call for a vote of no confidence in Junho and seize the leadership. The hall was opulent, decked in gold and crimson, filled with the most dangerous men in the country. Junho sat at the head of the table, looking gaunt and vacant, staring into his water glass while the other bosses whispered. Kenji stood up, smoothing his silk tie, radiating arrogance. "Brothers," Kenji began, his voice projecting strength. "We gather in difficult times. Our leader is unwell. Grief is a heavy burden, one that has compromised his judgment. For the good of the family, we must make hard choices." Hannah sat by his side, nodding in agreement, though her eyes darted nervously around the room. "I propose a restructuring," Kenji continued, raising a hand to silence the murmurs. "A new direction." Suddenly, the lights in the grand hall flickered and died, plunging the room into pitch blackness. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by the sound of guns being cocked. "Stay calm," Kenji shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Backup generators." But the lights didn't come back on. Instead, the massive screen behind the head table, usually used for financial presentations, flared to life. Grainy footage appeared. It was a recording from inside a hospital morgue. The angle was low, hidden. It showed Kenji and Hannah standing over a body covered in a sheet. The audio was crystal clear. "Is she gone?" Hannah's voice asked. "Finally," Kenji's voice replied, dripping with malice. "The bitch is dead. Now we just wait for Junho to cry himself to sleep, and the city is ours." The room went deathly silent. The lights slammed back on, blindingly bright. Kenji stood frozen, his face the color of chalk. He looked at Junho, expecting to see the broken man. Instead, he saw Junho leaning back in his chair, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. Junho slowly raised a finger. His finger did not point at Kenji, but past him, directing every eye in the room toward the heavy double doors at the far end of the banquet hall. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Slowly, with the grinding groan of heavy oak on brass hinges, the doors swung open. The darkness of the hallway spilled in, and from that shadow emerged a silhouette that made the blood drain from 50 hardened faces. Elena stepped into the light. She was not wearing the shroud of the grave, nor the white of a ghost. She was dressed in a gown of crimson silk that flowed around her like liquid fire, a stark, violent contrast to the sea of black suits. Her hair was loose, a dark cascade down her back, and her face, though pale, was set in a mask of imperious judgment. She walked down the center aisle, the clicking of her heels on the marble floor echoing like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The clan heads parted instinctively, shrinking away as if her very presence was a divine intervention or a curse brought to life. Kenji stumbled back, his legs hitting the edge of the table, sending silverware clattering to the floor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out, only a dry, rattling wheeze. Hannah was not so silent. She let out a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror, clawing at her own throat as if the phantom poison she had administered was now choking her. "It's not possible," she screamed, her composure shattering into hysteria. "I saw you. I saw you dead." Elena stopped 3 feet from them, her gaze cold enough to freeze the air in the room. "You saw what you wanted to see, Hannah," Elena said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to every corner of the hall. "You saw a victim. You saw a weakness. You never looked close enough to see the wife of Junho Park." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the silver bracelet, the camellia charm glinting under the chandelier lights, and tossed it onto the table in front of Kenji. It landed with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. "You returned this to my husband to break him," she said softly. "Instead, you gave him the map to find me." Junho stood up then, the movement slow and deliberate, shedding the skin of the grieving widower to reveal the predator beneath. He walked around the table, the other bosses watching him with a mixture of fear and renewed awe. He stopped beside Elena, his hand finding the small of her back, a gesture of possession and protection that communicated more power than any weapon could. "You called a vote," Junho said to the room, his voice low but thundering with authority. "You wanted to discuss the future of the syndicate. You wanted to talk about leadership." He turned his gaze to Kenji, who was now trembling violently, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping onto his pristine collar. "My cousin believed that love made me weak. He believed that grief would blind me. But he forgot the first rule of our blood. We do not just survive tragedy, we weaponize it." Junho leaned in close to Kenji, his eyes dark voids. "You didn't just try to kill my wife, Kenji. You tried to kill my soul. And for that, there is no negotiation. There is no exile. The betrayal was too deep, the violation of the code too absolute." The other clan heads, sensing the shift in the wind, turned their backs on the conspirators, forming a wall of silence. Kenji fell to his knees, grasping at Junho's pant leg, blubbering pleas for mercy, invoking their childhood, their shared blood. "We are family, Junho. Please." It was a mistake. Junho looked down at him with an expression of profound pity, but it was the pity one feels for a rabid dog that must be put down. "You are right," Junho said. "We were family, but you died the moment you signed the order for her death. I am just burying the corpse," he signaled to his loyal guards, who had emerged from the shadows of the room. They moved with efficient brutality. Hannah was dragged away screaming, her heels carving lines into the floor, while Kenji was lifted to his feet, his legs useless, his eyes wide with the realization of his end. There was no public execution. That was too messy, too undignified for the hall. They were simply removed, erased from the room as if they had never existed. The doors closed behind them, sealing their fate. Junho turned back to the assembly. The tension in the room was palpable, a physical weight. "The traitor is gone," he announced. "The weakness is purged." He looked at Elena, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine spark of life returned to his eyes. "And the queen has returned." The clan heads, men who bowed to no one but the strongest, slowly lowered their heads in a unified bow of respect, not just to Junho, but to the woman who had walked through the valley of death and returned to stand at his side. The meeting was adjourned not with a gavel, but with the silent acknowledgement that the Park dynasty was not ending. It was beginning a new, terrifying chapter. Hours later, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, Junho and Elena stood once again in the private cemetery. The mist was heavy, clinging to the ground and swirling around the ankles of the stone angels. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and ancient sorrow. They stood before the fresh grave, the one that bore the name Elena Park. The flowers Junho had left there days ago were wilted and brown, a testament to a grief that was now obsolete. The sight of her own name carved into granite was surreal for Elena, a jarring reminder of how close she had come to the void. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the phantom memory of the paralysis, the darkness of the coffin. Junho sensed her tremor and immediately removed his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. The heavy wool was warm and smelled of him, cedar, gunpowder, and rain. "It feels strange," she whispered, tracing the letters of her name on the stone. "To look at my own," and Junho stepped up beside her, a heavy sledgehammer in his grip, a tool he had taken from the groundskeeper's shed on their way in. His face was set in a grim line. "This is not your end," he said firmly. "This is a lie. And I am done living with lies." He raised the hammer, the muscles in his back bunching under his shirt, and brought it down with a primal roar. The sound of metal striking stone cracked through the silent cemetery like a thunderclap. A spiderweb of fractures appeared on the polished granite. He struck it again, and again, each blow fueled by the agony of the last week, the terror of the hospital, the rage of the betrayal. He was not just breaking a stone. He was shattering the timeline where he had lost her. Chunks of granite flew into the grass, obliterating the name Elena, erasing the dates of her birth and false death. Elena watched him, tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of catharsis. She didn't stop him. She let him destroy the symbol of their victimization. When he was finished, he dropped the hammer, his chest heaving, his hands raw. The headstone was a pile of rubble, a broken monument to a tragedy that had been averted. He turned to her, breathless, the wildness fading from his eyes to be replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness. "You are not buried here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You are here, with me." She buried her face in his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, the rhythm that had called her back from the edge. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "They will know. The world will know I am alive." Junho looked out over the mist-covered graves, toward the city skyline that was just beginning to glitter with the morning sun. The empire was secure, the enemies were vanquished, but the game had changed. They could no longer pretend to be normal. They had been forged in fire, and they had come out as steel. "Let them know," Junho replied, lifting her chin so he could look into her eyes. "Let them see that death could not keep you. We don't hide anymore, Elena. We build. We take everything they tried to steal from us, and we make it unbreakable." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the warmth of their skin sealing a new pact. They turned their backs on the ruined grave, on the symbol of death and despair, and began to walk toward the exit of the cemetery. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays through the trees, illuminating their path. They walked in silence, but the air between them was charged with a profound understanding. They had survived the worst the world could throw at them. They had faced the grave and walked away. As they reached the iron gates, Junho paused and looked back one last time at the debris of the headstone. It was just a pile of rocks now. The nightmare was over. He looked at his wife, the woman who had risen for him, and felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees again. But he stood tall. He was the boss, and she was his queen, and together, they were invincible. They stepped out of the gates and into the living world, ready to face whatever came next, hand in hand, leaving the ghosts behind them in the mist. If you enjoyed this story of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimate redemption, please like and subscribe for more emotional narratives.